Now I would like to talk about the Kursk offensive.
The Kiev regime was badly losing where the real battle of this war is taking place, which is in the Donbass. I'm a little flabbergasted by this idea, why making, tactical gains against podunk hamlets and villages, the largest one they seized was 5,000 people, is viewed as a success such that it would result in humiliation for Putin. But okay, all right, that's the way the narrative is going in the West. Okay, that's great. Humiliation doesn't win wars. Strategy does.
Now I would like to talk about the Kursk offensive. So the Western media highlighted that in the first few days of the offensive that Ukraine had managed to surprise Russia and it was successful in kind of embarrassing Russia. So how do you think the latest offensive is going, like the latest updates about the offensive?
Okay, so the Kiev regime was badly losing where the real battle of this war is taking place, which is in the Donbass, right? The contact line is in East Ukraine in the Donbass, and increasingly Russia was its strategy of attrition was just grinding through the Kiev regime's manpowers, Western gear and ammunition, fortifications that had been built up for a decade, in Chasiv Yar, in Toretsk and New York agglomeration, especially in the Pokrovsk direction, the vital supply lines where Russia had broken through the Kiev regime's defensive lines in Avdiivka and then moved into operational space in Ocheretina. So they felt the need they can see that they are losing and they will lose a war of attrition, right? The fact is that Russia is outproducing all of NATO put together in the type of munitions and arms that are needed for this type of land-centric, artillery-heavy war of attrition in Eurasia, right? Because the West military-industrial complex was not geared up for this type of war, right? They've been fighting counterinsurgency wars against tribal Islam for 3 decades in the Middle East, geared up towards that and high-end technological boondoggles like the F-35 and the littoral combat ship, and Europe's problem with over-specialization for niche NATO roles. They just weren't geared. The military-industrial complex had promised production on demand. If you ever really need these unsexy things like artillery shells and air defense interceptor missiles in large numbers, but the truth is they can't provide it, and they can't provide it in any window through ramping up to come anywhere close to Russian production levels of these things. And this has been admitted, right? The only difference is how many times. The New York Times at one point said Russia was outproducing all of NATO put together with artillery shell production by 7 times. CNN told us it was 3 times. Regardless, it's a huge, ridiculously huge number. And it's not just artillery shells. It's air defense interceptor missiles. It's tanks. It's these other things that are needed for this type of conflict. And Russia has the capability to produce them. And one of the reasons why is surge capacity in their military-industrial complex. After the Cold War ended, they didn't just get rid of old excess factories that could be quickly upgraded and produce slightly upgraded armaments because their military industrial complex is not driven for profit, right? Surge capacity was seen as a waste in the West, a waste of money. It was done away with. The surge capacity was kept in Russia, especially for this type of conflict, because this is the type of conflict. This is the conflict that Russia has been preparing for since the late 1940s, right? They never stopped. So their military-industrial complex is capable of wearing through this. So in order to change, the fact that even with all of NATO's help, that they couldn't beat Russia in a war of attrition, they need to somehow escape this box, this trap that they're in. And they came up Almost certainly, at least according to many Ukrainian media outlets like Resident, with active NATO assistance and planning and training. The Times admitted that Ukrainian troops for this offensive had been trained in the UK. Of an incursion in Kursk. And Kursk is north of the Sumy region. It has, for the most part, been a sleepy backwater of this conflict. Why? Because there's nothing strategic immediately, certainly not on the Russian side of the border, and other than roads that eventually lead to Kiev, not much on the Ukrainian side of the border either. It is a sparsely populated, heavily forest, strategic wasteland, which is why Russia had it very lightly defended, right? It was defended essentially with border patrol, with young Russian men, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds who were doing their 1 year of national service, like in Israel and Sweden and other countries that have such a thing. They have not been involved in the special military operation. And that was part of the political contract that Russia had, essentially unspoken with the Russian people, is that I won't send your young 18-year-old sons. It will be, in the very beginning, reservists called up to duty. And other than that, and since then, professional contract soldiers. But that is whom the very best that the Kiev regime forces had left, their very best brigades with their very best Western equipment, they successfully blew through a practically undefended border, pushing their way through border patrol and 18-year-old young guys doing their 1 year of national service. Great job. I mean, that was a tactical success. There's a lot of open questions about an intelligence failure on the Russian side, an intelligence failure, a military intelligence failure. Now, the Kiev regime had been building up forces in several areas, right? Across the northern front, in the in the Sumy region, but also just in the Kharkov region, over towards Belgorod, over towards Bryansk, in the Zaporozhye region, and they, for once, managed to keep operational secrecy. There was no trailer predicting this offensive months ahead of time, a Hollywood-style trailer like we saw with the Zaporozhye offensive in 2023, right? They were able, I believe, to hide a buildup of forces in the city of Sumy itself. Cities make it much easier to hide equipment. And what military buildup Russians did see, was more than likely dismissed as defensive, because it was actually widely talked that Russia might launch an offensive, not really for the Sumy region, but through the Sumy region towards Kiev again, maybe sometime in the late autumn. So that they may have mistaken a buildup as a defensive buildup. Regardless, right? We, I think, have to assume that they achieved some level of surprise. There are some Russian military analysts who believe that Putin knew, the Russian Ministry of Defense knew the offensive was going to happen and decided to let it happen. I don't think there's enough evidence of that, but just putting it out there, some people do think so. I do believe the Russian military can make mistakes. They've made lots of mistakes during this conflict. It's lucky that they have such a massive military industrial complex and a population that supports it, and countries that are the rest of the world outside the West that is willing to trade with Russia, despite the West's existential economic war of sanctions on the country, because otherwise it would be a lot more difficult. So, what is the rationale for this incursion? Well, we've heard practically a dozen different things, right? They keep tossing different things around, right? So one reason they chose the Kursk region, obviously because it was a backwater with no strategic value, certainly not for the Kiev regime. It was lightly defended, right? So they had a guarantee of some level of tactical success, which they more or less achieved. Now, the idea that they could humiliate Putin, right? I'm a little flabbergasted by this idea. Why making tactical gains against podunk hamlets and villages? The largest one they seized was 5,000 people, is viewed as a success such that it would result in a humiliation for Putin. But okay, all right, that's the way the narrative is going in the West. Okay, that's great. Humiliation doesn't win wars. Strategy does. And maybe it'll make you feel good with the headlines on the pages of the Western mainstream media and the talking heads, talking stick it to the Russians, yay, for a month. But I think the media is starting to sober up to see what the consequences of this fleeting moment of celebration and joy, what the cost of it is. There is some indication, although they've been very coy about admitting it, that they hoped to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant, either to create some type of catastrophe. They've been shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant for almost 2 years now. They attempted to seize it several times. The Kiev regime's psychopathic military intelligence chief, Kirilo, I like the dark Budanov, who refuses to be interviewed with the lights on. I don't know, maybe he's a vampire. He seems to have a real hard-on for creating nuclear fantasies of nuclear catastrophe. Or the other possibility is they hope to trade it back for the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Regardless, they would have had to seize it with surprise and mobility, and in the first 3 or 4 days of their incursion, and they didn't. Right, they were stopped before that. So that's basically off the table. They've taken a few pot shots with missiles and drones at it, but they've tapered off even with that once the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency came for a tour at Russia's invitation. So that is out. All right, if that was a goal, they failed in that. The idea that they could get Russia to divert forces away from where the principal fighting is happening in the Donbass, particularly in the Pokrovsk region, it's just a propaganda talking point, because it's the exact opposite. The Kiev regime stripped forces from the Donbass, from Pokrovsk, to launch this offensive, right? And again, the source for that is the Western mainstream media, who did interviews with commanders of battalions, of brigades, that said, hey, we were pulled off of Kursk. Who's going to do our job there? We were pulled off of Pokrovsk. What's going to happen there? So the exact opposite is true. Russia did not divert forces away from Pokrovsk. Why? Because they don't have a manpower problem. So they were able to bring in out of theater reserves that hadn't been committed yet. They weren't able to get them in for a few days, but they got them in, and that contained the incursion. And so that is not a solution. The idea that they could use it is as leverage in negotiations to trade back for territory that Russia holds of Ukraine, that the Kiev regime claims. Okay, well, Russia said, no negotiations. We're done. Certainly not while you're in Kursk, right? Why? Because we don't have to go to negotiations from a position of relative weakness as a result of that. We can wait. We know we can take that territory back. We know that you can't sustain it long term, that your logistics and supply, that your manpower are hurting. But I'll be perfectly honest with you. It is perfectly clear that Russia, the Russian government, the Ministry of Defense, they are no hurry to push the Kiev regime forces out of Kursk, right? Because, again, this was a very sparsely populated area, right? A few, we're talking 20, 30,000 people max in the area that the Kiev regime now claims it controls, right? They have forces strung out in a few podunk hamlets and villages, but that actually doesn't really mean control of this large territory, because that conflict there isn't like in East Ukraine. It's not static positional warfare with trenches and artillery. It's not like that. It's more fluid, right? It's mobile units. It's dueling diversion and reconnaissance groups, DRGs, hunting each other down in the forests of the Kursk region. That's the way to combat. So to claim they control 500 square kilometers, that's a propaganda talking point. And it doesn't mean anything, because Russia isn't fighting a maneuver war of territorial conquest. Not yet. They're fighting a war of attrition. And a war of attrition does not prioritize taking territory. It prioritizes destroying the enemy military, of having a very favorable casualty ratio. And they're achieving that. As far as they're concerned, Kursk is a firebag, right? Look they're in a salient, surrounded on three sides by Russian air superiority, dropping glide bombs, by Russian artillery, by Russian drone superiority. They have massacred an enormous amount of Western equipment that cannot be easily, if at all, replaced. They've lost at least 5 HIMARS systems on this, right? They've lost hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles and armored fighting vehicles. There was even a piece in Forbes that admitted, doing some analysis, that they are losing equipment twice as fast in Kursk as they were on the contact line in the Donbass. Now, that makes perfect sense. Why? Because in Kursk, they're not in built-in fortifications that have been built up for years. They're not fighting in these tight urban agglomerated areas of the Donbass that are great for defense, with high-rise buildings that everyone can be turned into a mini fortress, with factories, with coal mines, with these Terracon artificial slag hills. No, these are podunk villages with little houses, with dacha houses. You can't defend this territory like you could that territory. So they've exposed their best remaining troops, their best remaining Western equipment, in places that they can't defend and can't properly supply. And instead of recognizing that it's a failure because they're driven more by information warfare than military strategy, they refuse to admit that it was a mistake and just do the smart thing and pull what troops they can out. And Russia's doing everything it can to keep them there, because as they're keeping them there, Russian forces are street fighting in the center of Selidova and are on the outskirts, taking the suburbs of Pokrovsk, the Kiev regime's vital transport hubs for logistics and supply that keep their forces in the Donbass. This is the beating heart, right, of the supply for the Kiev regime's remaining forces in the Donbass region. And Russia is right now severing the artery. They want to keep those forces in Kursk. They want the Kiev regime to keep throwing away good manpower and equipment and ammunition after bad there. They're content to let those forces sit there for months. Now, if they pull all of their forces out of Kursk to go back to Pokrovsk, as they're beginning to do, right? They pulled them one way, now they're pulling them back the other way. Then Russia will say, all right, now you've weakened these forces here, now we'll move here, right? Russia has a manpower advantage and an equipment advantage, so they can go wherever the Kiev regime is weakest and still maintain the status quo on the contact lines in other places. The Kiev regime can't do that. They can't defend everywhere. They're still trying to. And they certainly can't defend everywhere and launch a fool's crusade offensive that has netted them nothing strategically. And again, if you want to say that it has humiliated Putin, okay, good job. Wait, now what? This is it was tactically at some level a success. And it was an enormous strategic blunder that has helped accelerate the operational crisis that is happening right now in central and south Donbass.
So I think that was a great explanation because even eminent Professor Stephen Walt, even he highlighted in a piece in Foreign Policy magazine that Ukraine might have captured only about 0.0064% of Russian land, whereas
It's a pin dot on a map. I mean,
whereas Ukraine, Russia would have captured around 20% of Ukrainian land, and
and
it remains and the success remains debatable. Sorry, sir. Go on.
yeah, and it's not even the quantity of the land. It's what that land is. It's the quality. It's the strategic value of the land. Again, just taking territory doesn't mean anything in this type of war. That's an easy metric. Oh, they've taken territory. It must mean they're winning. That's not the way a war of attrition works. It's very hard to understand. It's very hard to explain to a public. It's even hard for a Western military that scoffs at attrition warfare and believes in their Jedi art of maneuver warfare to understand. And I'll tell you right now, the US's top generals did not understand why the 2023 offensive that they planned and war gamed out for the Kiev regime failed. Mark Milley was swearing by the success. The U.S. military doesn't understand, that without the air superior, the overwhelming air and long range strike superiority that the U.S. has always enjoyed in its conflicts against essentially third world countries and tin pot little dictators, that when you're fighting a pure adversary, it inevitably becomes an attrition conflict. And they might be learning that lesson now, but maybe not.